Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The village was called Omukura, a place so distant from noise that even time seemed to slow there. Obinna and Chidera arrived on a cool morning, dusty and bruised, with nothing but each other and an envelope of crumpled naira notes. Mama Ifeoma, the old widow who had once taken them in after Nsukka, had a brother there, a silent man named Madu. With no questions asked, he offered them an old, unplastered room behind his farm shed. The roof leaked when it rained, the mattress had no foam, and rats scurried beneath the floor, but to them it felt like a kingdom. Each morning, they rose before the cocks, fetching water from the stream, helping weed the cassava beds, and teaching the children of the village with chalk and broken benches. Obinna used his knowledge to help with community land disputes, while Chidera began teaching tailoring to 3 curious girls with a borrowed machine. In this forgotten place, they weren't fugitives, just 2 young people trying to live. Yet even peace has its price. The longer they stayed, the more their presence stirred whispers. The village was small, and strangers did not stay strangers for long. Some speculated they were hiding from family wars. Others claimed they were lovers cursed by spirits. A few, especially the women, looked at Chidera with a mix of admiration and pity. "She works like one carrying a secret," one said. "The man looks like he once wore city perfume," another whispered. But Obinna and Chidera kept to themselves. They smiled. They gave. They healed slowly in silence. At night, they would sit on the log behind their room, watching the stars while holding hands. "Do you miss them?" Chidera once asked, her voice low. "Only my mother," Obinna replied. "And maybe who I was before I became the son of a governor." The ache in his voice was real, but there was no regret, only quiet acceptance of the path they had chosen. Still, something unspoken began to rise in Chidera's heart, a soft sense of foreboding. Sometimes, she noticed the way some villagers watched them too closely. The man who owned the palm wine joint always seemed to linger when Obinna came near. A group of young boys, once friendly, had grown cold. One morning, she saw a visitor speaking to the village headman, then leaving quickly without explanation. She said nothing to Obinna, but her mind stirred with warning. They had run for so long. Could they really stop running now? That evening, as Obinna fixed the hinge on their broken door, she sat beside him and whispered, "What if we're not as hidden as we think?" He looked at her, eyes calm but searching. "Then we'll stay one step ahead. We always have." But deep within both of them, they knew peace never lasts forever when power is chasing blood. In the capital city, Governor Uma stood in his once glorious study, now stripped to warmth. He wore his agbada like it was armor, but his face betrayed him, weary, hardened, and drenched in fear. His political house was crumbling faster than he had prepared for. Chief Maduka had officially withdrawn his influence, and opposition members were slowly uniting against him. Amara had become unpredictable, and the press had started to ask uncomfortable questions about Obinna's disappearance. Yet none of these weighed on him as heavily as the one thought he couldn't shake, the fact that his son had chosen that Maid over everything. It wasn't just defiance, it was humiliation, a rejection of his legacy, a betrayal of the very structure of power he built. And worst of all, Obinna hadn't returned. He hadn't cracked. That meant someone was helping him survive, and that was dangerous. Determined to end the embarrassment once and for all, Uma met privately with a man known only as Kazim, a former intelligence operative with ties to the underworld. They met in a dimly lit compound far from the governor's residence. "I don't want them dead," Uma said, though his tone didn't match the words. "I want them forgotten." Kazim, tall and unsmiling, lit a cigar and nodded slowly. "We'll locate them. Silently. My men will pose as local charity workers, builders, engineers. Villages always open their arms when you promise new boreholes." The plan was simple. Infiltrate rural regions under false names, identify the fugitives, extract them, and leave no trace. Uma didn't blink. "Bring me my son," he said. And if that girl gets in the way, do what you must. He poured himself a drink afterward, trembling. He was not afraid of the law. He was afraid of the boy who looked into his eyes and said, "I'll never be like you." Back in Umikuta, Kazim's men began arriving in pairs. They wore matching shirts with the logo of a fake NGO, Rise for Rural Women. They handed out biscuits and paracetamol, promised sewing machines, and took photographs with villagers. Obinna remained polite but distant. Chidera didn't trust them, not the way they stared too long, not the way they asked questions about talented youth in hiding, or bright girls who deserve more. They never asked for money, only stories. "Where do you come from?" one asked Obinna during a farm meeting. "Everywhere," Obinna said with a smile, but inside he stiffened. The storm had finally reached them. But would they see it before it swallowed them whole? Obinna sat beneath the Udala tree near the stream, reading an old book to children, while Chidera embroidered a torn wrapper nearby. The wind was calm, the laughter of children soft and full of life. Then Kunnel, the old driver who once helped them escape the mansion, appeared out of nowhere. He wore a faded cap pulled low, and carried a brown envelope inside a bag of groundnuts. "Your mother said to give this to you. No one must know," he whispered quickly before disappearing back into the bush path. Obinna opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, handwritten in familiar loops and curls. It was from Lady Evelyn. The moment he saw her handwriting, his heart skipped. The letter read like a prayer and a plea. She told him everything. That the bounty placed on Chidera's head had been increased. That mercenaries disguised as social workers were operating in village clusters, and some had already killed in other regions. She warned him not to trust anyone offering help. She spoke of the governor's desperation, how power was slipping from his grip, and how his obsession had turned into something inhuman. "My son," the letter ended, "I may not be able to protect you anymore, but if you still carry my voice in your spirit, then run. Not because you're weak, but because she is worth more than anything you've lost." The ink was smudged at the bottom, either by her tears or her rushed hand. Obinna folded the paper and pressed it to his forehead. His mother's voice had finally broken the silence. When he returned to their small room that evening, he said nothing at first. He simply knelt beside Chidera, took her hand, and said, "They're here. Not in spirit, in flesh. Men sent by my father." Her eyes widened. "How do you know?" He pulled out the letter and let her read it in silence. As she did, tears welled up, not from fear, but exhaustion. "How long can we keep doing this?" she whispered. "How long will we run?" Obinna cupped her face. "Until the world stops treating your love for me like a crime." That night they packed a small bag. No goodbye to the villagers, no notes. Only silence and moonlight. Because sometimes running isn't cowardice. It's choosing to live long enough to be heard. The morning after they read Lady Evelyn's letter, Obinna and Chidera set out quietly before the village stirred. They carried nothing but a worn school bag stuffed with their documents, some gari, sachets of milk, and a bottle of palm oil. Their feet hurt before they reached the first stream. The road ahead was unknown, but staying meant death. They walked until dusk, taking footpaths and bush trails known only by hunters. The weight of fear pressed on them like a second skin, but even that fear could not steal their tenderness for each other. Every time they stopped to rest, Obinna would squeeze her hand, and Chidera would rest her head on his shoulder. Their silence was not absence. It was filled with unspoken prayers that this, too, would pass. Back in Umikuta, their sudden disappearance sparked rumors. Some claimed the couple was cursed and had been dragged into the bush by spirits. Others said they ran because they stole something. But the truth was only known by a select few, including the village youth named Emeka, a bright but ambitious young man who had once admired Chidera from a distance. He had befriended her under the guise of learning tailoring. But it was never about sewing. It was about proximity, about secrets. And when the charity workers began offering cash for information about strangers with city accents, Emeka didn't hesitate. For 200,000 Nigerian nairas and a false promise of a job, he gave them everything. Where Chidera fetched water, the mango tree they sat under, even the names they used for themselves. He didn't see it as betrayal. He saw it as payment for what he never received, her love. By the next day, armed men arrived at the village in the guise of police officers investigating an abduction case. They broke into Obinna and Chidera's room, ransacked everything, and threatened Pamadou and Mama Ifioma. Obinna's shirt was found hanging behind the door, stained from a nosebleed days earlier. It was enough. The officers claimed it was evidence of a kidnapping and possible murder. The village head, fearing political retaliation, authorized the detention of Chidera's tailoring students and called a town meeting. They are dangerous, he declared, and anyone harboring them henceforth will be punished. The bounty was increased publicly, 1 million Nigerian nairas for information leading to Chidera's arrest. As the posters were nailed to trees and walls, a cruel irony echoed through the hills. The same girl who once stitched clothes for free and taught children was now being hunted like a criminal. By the time Obinna and Chidera reached the next village, they were exhausted beyond words. They hadn't bathed in days, their feet were swollen, and their spirits weighed heavy. They begged for shelter at a small Catholic convent where the nuns, unaware of their past, took them in for the night. Chidera helped clean the chapel, while Obinna mopped the compound and read Bible stories to the orphans. For 2 days, they breathed again. But peace was always brief, like borrowed sunlight before storm. On the third evening, while they helped carry firewood, Chidera saw someone watching them from the tree line. A boy no older than 17, who vanished the moment she made eye contact. Her chest tightened. She told Obinna, and they agreed not to stay another night. But by then it was too late. The boy was Emeka's cousin, sent by Kazim's men to comb outlying communities. He had recognized Chidera by the scar above her left eyebrow, one she got as a child defending Obinna from bullies. That scar, once a mark of courage, had become the signature that would lead enemies to them. That night, masked men returned. They came with dogs, torches, and forged arrest warrants. They raided the convent, slapped one of the nuns, and broke open the pantry door looking for the fugitives. Obinna and Chidera had already fled by then, warned moments earlier by a mute orphan girl who had overheard whispers. They escaped barefoot into the forest, guided only by moonlight and desperation. The howls of dogs echoed behind them like a war drum. They didn't stop running for hours. By dawn, they collapsed near a riverbank, mud-covered and shaking. Obinna had injured his foot on a sharp stone, and Chidera tore her wrapper to bind it. They hid under an old canoe until the sun rose high. That day, Obinna didn't speak much. His breathing was heavy, and his skin was hot with fever. Chidera wept as she fetched water and crushed herbs to cool his body. "This is my fault," she sobbed. "If I had left your life when they told me to." Obinna touched her face with what strength he had. "No," he whispered. "You are my life." And then he passed out. Chidera sat beside him, her hands shaking. She no longer feared death. She feared losing the only reason she kept surviving. They spent 2 nights in that forest edge, hidden among thorny bushes and crawling insects. Obinna's fever worsened, his legs swelling from infection. Chidera knew he needed help, but help meant exposure. She chose to risk it. Wrapping her hair with a scarf and tying Obinna's necklace around her wrist, she walked into the closest village, pretending to be a trader whose brother was sick from malaria. She met an old woman named Mama Ikin, who listened kindly and offered an abandoned yam barn to hide him. With her help, Chidera carried Obinna into the shed that night, using an old wheelbarrow. It was humiliating, desperate, and slow, but it was all she could do to save him. Each time he groaned, she whispered, "Just stay alive. Just a little longer." Mama Ikin, who had once served as a cook in government houses decades ago, gave Chidera herbs and bitter roots. She also gave advice. "This world does not hate you because you are poor," she said. "It hates you because you're brave enough to love someone above your level." Chidera said nothing, but her tears spoke. For 5 days, she nursed Obinna. His fever broke. He opened his eyes on the 6th day, weak but alive. "Did we make it?" he asked. Chidera smiled, wiping his brow. "Not yet, but we're still writing the story." That night, he held her hand tightly as they lay on straw, and for the first time since fleeing, they both slept without fear. But just before dawn, Chidera awoke to the sound of voices. She peeped through a crack in the barn and saw men questioning villagers again, asking about strangers, offering money, flashing fake IDs. Her heart sank. They weren't safe. Nowhere was. She returned to Obinna and shook him gently. "We have to go again," she said, "but this time we're not just running. We're going to fight." He looked at her, his eyes sunken but fierce. "Then let's find a war we can win." As they packed what little they had, Chidera looked back once more at the shed that had saved his life. "We've left blood in the dust," she whispered. "Now, it's time to leave footprints that will never be erased." The rain fell in slow, heavy drops as Obinna and Chidera limped into a quiet, overgrown compound outside Achi, a town tucked between forgotten hills and fading roads. They had followed a path drawn by Mama Ikin, whose brother once served as a driver to a former governor's estate. "There is a house at the end of the hill," she had whispered. "The couple there, they too were thrown away after years of loyalty. Tell them Mama Ikin sent you." With trembling hope and soaked clothes, they arrived at the moss-covered gate, where time had swallowed the paint, and vines had crept across rusted iron. Chidera knocked, then again. Minutes passed. A small slit in the door opened. An old woman's eyes met theirs. No words were exchanged, only a long, knowing stare. And then the gate creaked open. Inside the compound, silence reigned. The garden was unkempt, the walls cracked, and the furniture sparse. But there was warmth in the air, the kind that comes only from shared pain. The old woman introduced herself as Madame Rayliot, and her husband, slouched in a cane chair, was called Baba Gambo. They were both in their 70s and had once worked in the Uma family's original residence. Madame Rayliot had been a personal maid to Governor Uma's wife for over a decade, while Baba Gambo was his father's head driver. But like many loyal servants, they were discarded without pension or farewell when Uma rose in power and moved to the capital. "He forgot us," Baba Gambo muttered that night over a plate of roasted corn. But forgetting is not the same as being gone. We still remember everything. As Obinna recovered in one of the dusty inner rooms, Chidera sat with the couple, listening to stories that painted Governor Uma in a light she had never imagined. Ruthless even in youth, manipulative with charm, and cold toward those who had nothing to offer politically. But most importantly, the couple had collected things, letters, receipts, confidential documents, and audio recordings from their years in service. Out of bitterness? Perhaps. But more out of fear, in case they were ever targeted. "Your father," Madame Rayliot told Obinna the next morning, "was always scared of scandal. Even a whisper could bring him down. And now you carry the loudest truth he fears, your love for a girl he cannot control." For the first time in weeks, Obinna felt power again. Not the political kind, but the power of knowledge. He held Chidera's hand as she read through the old files. One sheet in particular made her pause. A contract for an illegal land sale Uma authorized using a fake widow's signature. "This alone," she whispered, "could ruin him." Obinna nodded. "But it's not just about ruin anymore. It's about reclaiming our names." The next day, while sweeping the back room of the compound, Chidera stumbled upon an old wooden trunk tucked beneath a collapsed shelf. It was dusty and locked with a rusted latch. Curious, she called Madame Rayliot, who retrieved a hidden key from a flower vase near the window. "I haven't opened this in over 10 years, the old woman said. Inside were faded photographs, medals, handwritten letters, and an old cassette tape labeled 1999 Uma's offer. As Chidera picked up the items carefully, Madame Rayliot's hands began to shake. "That tape," she said, "was recorded the night Uma bribed a commissioner to cover up a death in the old textile protest. He didn't know the recorder was running." Chidera's chest tightened. "You mean he covered up a killing?" Madame Rayliot nodded slowly. "A young girl, shot by police. And your Obinna's father made sure the world never found out." That night, the four of them gathered around an old radio cassette player. The voice on the tape was unmistakably that of a younger Governor Uma. His smooth, confident tone laid out a plan. Hush money to the commissioner, a fake autopsy report, and media control through selective tragedy. The audio was grainy, but the content was damning. Obinna sat silently, fists clenched, as the words echoed through the small room. It was more than just a political cover-up. It was evidence of criminal conspiracy. Baba Gambo lit his pipe and exhaled slowly. With this, he said, you can finally give the people a story worth believing. But be warned, a cornered lion does not go down without blood. Chidera placed a protective hand on Obinna's knee. Then let's sharpen our teeth, she replied. Because I'm done being afraid. They spent the following days sorting through the rest of the evidence, carefully photographing each document with Baba Gambo's old phone. Chidera also drafted a handwritten summary of the findings, dates, names, events, and their relevance to Obinna's wrongful arrest. Madame Rayliat reached out to her niece in Enugu, who worked in the media, and arranged a secret meeting with Dyke, the same journalist who had once believed in Chidera's innocence. When he arrived at the house, dressed like a local trader to avoid suspicion, he spent hours reviewing the materials, growing pale with every page. This, he said at last, is not just a story. It's history. And I'm going to make sure the world hears it. He promised to begin a campaign, starting with radio broadcasts in the region and eventually leaking the evidence to national news stations. Chidera's hands trembled as she handed over the tape. Let them hear the voice that tried to silence ours, she said. And maybe, just maybe, we'll stop running. As preparations to expose the governor grew behind closed doors, something softer and far more personal stirred in Chidera's body. She had missed her period twice, which she initially dismissed as stress. But when the smell of palm oil made her nauseous, and she began waking up dizzy, Madame Rayliat pulled her aside and gave her a knowing look. My dear, when last did your moon come? Chidera, cheeks flushed, whispered her truth. Later that night, with Obinna seated beside her under a flickering lantern, she told him. His face froze at first, not from fear, but from awe. We're having a baby, he whispered. She nodded, eyes glistening. And then, for the first time in months, Obinna laughed. Not a bitter, sarcastic laugh, but one born of overwhelming love. He pulled her into his arms, held her close, and whispered into her hair, You've given me more than life ever has. The news changed everything. Their fight was no longer just about names or injustice. It was about a child who would one day ask what legacy they had left behind. Chidera grew more protective, and Obinna more determined. He resumed light exercises to rebuild his strength, helped Baba Gambo in the garden, and began drafting a public letter addressed to the youth of Nigeria. I chose love over power, he wrote, and for that they called me a traitor. But if you knew her, if you knew how she gave up her comfort, her dreams, and her peace to shield me, you would understand that I didn't fall. I rose. Chidera read it and wept, not because it was poetic, but because it reminded her that even in hiding, her value had not been buried. As the weeks passed and the pregnancy grew stronger, Chidera began to teach neighborhood children again, this time in the abandoned garage at the edge of the compound. Word spread quickly. The gentle, educated woman was offering free lessons. Parents came with offerings, yams, palm wine, and fresh vegetables, in exchange for math and English tutoring. Slowly, the darkness began to lift. But even in joy, shadows waited. One afternoon, a little girl brought a note wrapped in a biscuit wrapper. It read, We know she is there. And we are coming. K. Obinna's smile disappeared when he read it. He stared out the window for a long time, then folded the note into his pocket. Let them come, he said quietly. But they'll meet more than just a maid and a trader's son. They'll meet a family worth fighting for. Governor Uma sat in his palatial office, surrounded by luxury but consumed by fear. Since Chief Maduka pulled his support and national news stations began hinting at upcoming political exposés, his hold on power had begun to crack. His name no longer commanded loyalty. His threats no longer silenced tongues. When his chief of staff, Bako, entered the room with a phone call from the party chairman, Uma didn't even lift his head. They're giving you one final chance, Bako said. Reinstate the marriage deal with Chief Maduka through another son, or make peace with impeachment. Uma clenched his fists. He had no other son. Obinna had been his only heir, and now he was the shame of the empire he'd spent 2 decades building. But then, another voice entered the room. Amara. "They're still away," she said. Her red lips curled into a cold smile. "Let me find them." Amara, though scorned, was not finished. What had started as a public disgrace had now become a personal vendetta. She wasn't just angry at Obinna. She was humiliated before her elite circles, mocked by media, and laughed at behind closed doors. She offered Uma a new deal. She would find Chidera, smear her, and eliminate her in a way that would restore Obinna's image and return him to power. "Once the maid is gone," she whispered, "you'll spin a new tale. Your son was drugged, seduced, rescued from shame. He'll become a symbol of moral correction." The governor stared at her in silence. He hated her pride, but loved the plan. It meant sacrificing the woman who had ruined everything, and possibly getting Obinna back on the political chessboard. That night, he approved funds for Amara's private mission, issuing her secret access to national security data, drones, and tap calls. "Make her vanish," he said, "and bring my son back clean." Back in the village, Chidera had no idea a final storm was brewing. The air around their compound grew strange. Market sellers paused when they passed. Strangers began wandering near their gate. At night, Obinna slept lightly, with a stick beside his bed. Chidera, already worn from the pregnancy, tried not to show her fear. But her instincts screamed. One night, while sweeping their tiny classroom garage, she saw a man taking pictures from across the bush. When she shouted, he ran. Obinna chased him, but lost him in the thickets. That night, they sat under the mango tree, holding hands. "He won't stop," Chidera whispered. "Your father, he won't rest until I'm erased." Obinna looked at her belly. "Then we'll make noise so loud they can't erase us." "Not this time." He walked into the room and returned with the audio cassette, the documents, and a phone number he had memorized for months, Dyke's private line. "It's time," he said. "Let the truth burn." Amara did not wait for permission. Armed with wealth, connections, and vengeance, she launched a quiet but effective media campaign that began as rumors and exploded into coordinated slander. A blog appeared overnight, titled, "The Maid Who Held the Governor's Son Hostage." In it, Chidera was described as a manipulative seductress who had bewitched Obinna using local charms, drugged his food, and taken him hostage in the village. Amara paid influencers, fake commentators, and anonymous bots to spread the lie across Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp. Photos of Chidera's old ID card were splashed online, doctored with images of bruises and fake pregnancy tests. It was a digital execution, and it worked at first. Within days, people across Nigeria began to whisper again, this time in doubt. Some believed the story, others didn't. But Obinna knew the power of false narratives. "If we don't strike now," he told Chidera, "we may never reclaim your name." They contacted Dyke, who confirmed that police had received anonymous tips and might soon raid the area. Obinna asked him to fast-track the exposé. Dyke hesitated. "The story needs witnesses," he said. "Proof beyond papers. Someone who can stand on camera and say, 'I saw it.'" Obinna turned to Baba Gambo and Madame Rayliot. The couple agreed. "Let the old speak truth while we still have breath," Rayliot said. She offered to testify on record about everything: the bribes, the death cover-up, and Uma's betrayal of staff. The plan was dangerous, but it was all they had. Meanwhile, Amara's campaign escalated. She arranged an arrest warrant under false charges: theft, impersonation, and identity fraud. She convinced the police commissioner in Enugu to quietly dispatch officers to Achi. But what Amara didn't know was that Dyke had already gone live. At 6:45 p.m. on a Wednesday, he published a teaser video titled "The Voice They Tried to Silence" on YouTube, with a blurred image of Chidera's face and the haunting line, "She ran to survive. Now she speaks to save us all." Within 1 hour, the video had 150,000 views. By midnight, it trended nationwide. Chidera, still unaware, sat in her classroom reading a storybook to children. When the school owner ran in crying and handed her a phone, she didn't understand, until she saw herself on screen, her soft voice echoing, saying, "If I have to die for the truth, then let the truth be worth it." She collapsed into Obinna's arms. The storm had begun, but this time, the wind blew in their favor. At dawn, the village gate trembled. 10 armed officers in dark uniforms stormed into Achi, carrying a warrant signed in Enugu. They didn't speak to the elders. They didn't follow protocol. They moved like hunters with one prey, Obinna Uma. The villagers, already divided by fear and bribes, stood by in silence. Some whispered prayers. Others took photos. Obinna saw them coming and raised his hands. "I won't run," he said. "Not anymore." Chidera, standing barefoot behind him, cried out as he was dragged into a black van. She tried to explain, to plead, to wave the truth in their faces, but they didn't care. "Governor's orders," one muttered. "You should have stayed hidden." They took him to Enugu. The charges were fabricated: criminal trespass, impersonation, spreading false information. He was denied bail and thrown into a small holding cell beneath a courthouse. No sunlight, no visits, just walls, sweat, and echoing silence. But Obinna, though physically bound, was free in spirit. He refused to beg. He refused to curse. Every day, he wrote letters on scraps of tissue paper, poured his heart into the words, and handed them to guards with kind eyes. "Give this to Chidera," he would say, "or keep it for when she wins." Meanwhile, the court date was postponed. Rumors spread that Uma had bribed the judge. It didn't matter. Outside, the fire was rising. Chidera refused to mourn. She went to Dyke Station and gave her first live interview. Her voice cracked, but her eyes blazed. "They took him because he loved me," she said. "They locked him because we dared to tell the truth. But you can't jail-proof." Then, she held up the audio cassette on air. The studio played Uma's voice. The country heard him plan corruption, mock the poor, and admit to scandal. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Free Obinna. Hashtag Justice for Chidera. Hashtag Voice of the Maid. Dyke's second episode aired footage of Madame Rayliat and Baba Gambo sharing their testimonies. Schools paused to play the video. Churches referenced it in sermons. Protesters filled the gates of the Enugu courthouse. One man was heard shouting, "They thought she was just a maid, but she's the country's mirror." And in a quiet cell, Obinna heard a guard whisper, "Sir, you've started something too big to stop." The television studio was silent as Chidera walked in. She wore a plain gown with faded thread around the collar, and her shoes were mismatched, evidence of the rush and stress of the past 2 days. But her voice, when she began to speak, carried a strength that silenced even the makeup artist backstage. Sitting opposite Dyke, she stared into the camera, clutching the worn necklace Obinna had once given her as children. "They told me to run," she began. "They told me I was not good enough, not clean enough, not rich enough to love a governor's son." Her voice trembled briefly, then steadied. "But I'm not here to defend my love. I'm here to expose a lie that has crippled truth in this country." The interview aired live, and Chidera didn't just talk. She told a story. She spoke of her childhood with Obinna, of their bond that predated wealth, politics, and betrayal. She shared how she had worked as a maid to support her education, how she endured years of humiliation in the Uma mansion, and how she was nearly murdered on a silent night. "He chose me," she said softly, "not because I was powerful, but because I was true. He chose me when it cost him everything." Dyke, visibly moved, allowed her to hold up the cassette, Obinna's recorded voice, exposing the governor's hand in framing them. "This is my protection," she said, "and my only weapon." When the footage rolled and Governor Uma's voice echoed in full across the country, plotting, mocking, threatening, there was a stillness before the storm. And then the switchboards lit up. Across Nigeria, the response was volcanic. Radio stations replayed the confession. Women's groups marched. Student unions protested. Churches began vigils. Social media flooded with art, poems, and tributes titled, "The Maid Who Refused to Bow." Within hours, journalists from BBC, CNN Africa, and Al Jazeera requested interviews. Political activists began pushing for a full inquiry into Governor Uma's administration. Meanwhile, Chidera, who hadn't slept in 3 days, curled up on the studio's couch with her hands on her belly. A female producer brought her food and whispered, "You're no longer just Chidera. You're a mother carrying a nation's hope." And in a dark cell beneath the Enugu court, a young man smiled as a prison officer slid in a note that read, "She spoke." The country heard. It began with a single candle outside the Enugu courthouse, a young girl in her school uniform, standing with a hand-painted cardboard sign, "My mother is also a maid." By nightfall, hundreds of candles flickered. Elders, students, street traders, and even ex-government workers joined. People cried not just for Chidera, but for every woman who had been silenced by power, every love story destroyed by status, every truth buried under ambition. Major networks interrupted programming to replay clips from Chidera's broadcast. One pastor in Abuja preached, "Chidera is not just a girl. She is the daughter of truth." Hashtags #Free Obinna, #Truth and Dust, and #Chidera Speaks trended for days. And for the first time in his career, Governor Uma's press team refused to issue a statement, because no lie could fix this. Obinna's condition in prison worsened. He developed a cough from the damp cell and grew thin. Yet when the warden whispered that the country was on fire for him and his maid, he wept quietly against the wall. Every day, guards passed notes from supporters, some from children, some from strangers who saw in him the son they never had. One message read, "They can chain your body, but they've unlocked our minds." Despite threats from higher officials to suppress the protests, the people did not stop. Instead, more witnesses came forward. A former accountant revealed how the governor rerouted millions. A former driver confessed to overhearing calls plotting Obinna's arrest. Even Lady Evelyn, silenced for years, stepped forward with a story that broke the dam. Lady Evelyn appeared on television with trembling hands. She wore her wedding ring, but turned it backward. Her voice cracked as she described a life of quiet survival. "I watched my husband destroy lives to build a name," she said, "and now he has destroyed his own son for the same name." She confirmed the fake kidnapping story, the forged charges, and the assassination attempt on Chidera. When the interviewer asked why she didn't speak earlier, she replied, "Because I was afraid. But if my silence becomes their grave, then I am no mother." That night, Nigeria didn't sleep. Songs were written. A documentary titled "The Girl in Uniform" was announced. The people were no longer just watching, they were demanding. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth. Love, when it refuses to die, becomes revolution. Lady Evelyn stood in front of a national tribunal, her eyes fixed on the faces that once bowed to her husband. Her voice, though gentle, carried the weight of years buried in silence. "I married a man who told me dreams were for the weak," she began. "But I gave birth to a son who dared to dream and love outside the chains of class." Her confession included secret meetings she witnessed, letters she hid, and the night she walked in on Governor Uma, threatening to destroy Chidera's family. "I feared for my life," she said, "but I fear more the legacy I would leave if I allowed this to continue." As she spoke, her son's trial was delayed, and pressure mounted on the governor's office. His enemies had returned, not with bullets, but with truth. The public reaction to her statement was electric. Women called her brave, men called her redeemed, and youth called her mother. She wasn't just defending Obinna. She was undoing the shame of every parent who traded morality for prestige. Reporters camped outside her house. Civil society groups requested her support for new reforms protecting domestic workers. But most notably, she received a letter, one handwritten, tear-stained, and signed simply, "Chidera." In it, Chidera thanked her for the coins she once hid under her mattress, for the silent nods of warning, and for the love she never voiced but always showed. "You were the only reason I believed someone in that mansion still had a heart," the letter ended. Evelyn pressed the paper to her lips and cried. That same day, a journalist read aloud a letter from Obinna on national TV. His words were raw. "I write this from a cell that stinks of urine and hope. My name is no longer Uma in this place. I am simply Obinna, and that is enough, because Chidera still calls me by it." He ended the letter with a vow. "If they free me, I will rebuild my life not on sandcastles of power, but on bricks of truth. With her. Always with her. Viewers wept openly. Activists demanded immediate release. The judge, now under scrutiny, called for an emergency review. Meanwhile, in that same cell, Obinna folded his hands and prayed. "Let them come," he whispered. "Let them come with fire or light. I have nothing to lose. And everything to begin again." Obinna sat alone in the dim prison corridor, his hands bound not just by metal, but by memory. The interview with his mother had reached him through the whispers of a sympathetic guard. That night he cried for the first time in weeks, not because of pain, but because of the rare light of dignity returning to a world that had stripped him of everything. With trembling hands, he tore pages from a school exercise book that a cleaner smuggled in, and began to write. His letter wasn't addressed to the court or the government. It was for the people. He called it to the ones who listened. In it, he bled truth. He spoke of his love for Chidera, a girl born in the same dust as him, but denied the right to dream just because her hands bore soap and not silver. "I do not regret choosing her," he wrote. "I regret being born into a name that tried to make me forget her." The letter moved like wildfire. Dyke, the journalist, published it with the headline, "The Son Who Refused the Throne." It was read aloud on television, quoted in newspapers, and translated into 3 local languages. One university professor compared it to the prison letters of Mandela. The letter's rawness shattered every illusion of Obinna being a pampered rich boy manipulated by a maid. Instead, it revealed the man who had been burned by the very name that birthed him. "If I must rot in this cell for the truth, let it be so," the letter read. "But know this, love never dies in silence. It resurrects through pain." Citizens gathered at court gates to demand his release. Artists began murals in his name, and students across Enugu printed copies of the letter for study. The prison walls, once suffocating, now felt like the birthplace of something sacred. Meanwhile, inside the Uma mansion, Governor Uma read the same letter with shaking hands. For the first time, his voice failed him. He had mocked his son's gentleness for years, but this was not softness. It was fire. His allies had begun to vanish. Chief Maduka severed ties. His own party members whispered of removing him to protect the party's image. International news outlets reported the scandal with brutal accuracy. His phone rang less and less. When it did, it was to demand answers. Still, he refused to resign. In a moment of quiet madness, he shouted, "Let them remember my name." But even he could feel it. The name Uma, once etched in granite, was now sinking into mud. He thought of his son, of the daughter he never wanted, and of the empire he built with silence and fear, and now it was paper in a storm. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The crowd spilled into the compound, where giant speakers echoed every word uttered inside. Security forces lined the gates, not to keep out protesters, but to protect what had now become the most watched trial in the country. Obinna was escorted into the courtroom in chains, but he walked with his head high. Chidera was already seated, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly. The judge, a woman known for her integrity, stared down at the politicians, the lawyers, and the media frenzy before her. "We are not here to crown a villain or sanctify a victim," she said. "We are here to expose truth, regardless of whose name it bears." With that, the first document was presented, a forged police order for Obinna's arrest, signed by a governor's aide, now mysteriously unreachable. Then came the recorded call, Governor Uma's voice, cold and calculating, giving instructions that left the courtroom breathless. The defense stuttered. Their strategy had been built on lies, and now it was crumbling. Lady Evelyn took the stand. With a quiet voice and tearful eyes, she recounted the years of intimidation and deceit. She detailed the bounty placed on Chidera, the fabricated kidnapping narrative, and the threats made against her if she ever spoke. "My silence was not loyalty," she said. "It was survival. But today, I choose my son over my silence." The court listened. Hearts broke. Former staff, including Matilda the maid and Connell the driver, gave testimony. And finally, Chidera stood. Her testimony was less about law and more about love. I never wanted to be in a courtroom, she said. I only wanted to be loved, without fear. After 5 days of proceedings, the judgment was delivered. The forged arrest order, the assassination attempt, the bribe trails, the false charges, all were proven. Obinna was declared innocent and released immediately. The court ordered Governor Uma to face separate charges for abuse of office, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice. Amara, whose lies had fueled the public smear, was fined heavily and banned from holding any political post for 10 years. The courtroom erupted, not with noise, but with tears. Obinna stepped forward and hugged Chidera, the chains finally off, her tears soaking into his shirt. Cameras flashed, but they barely noticed. This was their moment, not the nation's. Outside, chants of justice for Chidera, justice for Obinna, echoed across Enugu. Truth had won, not quickly, not easily, but fully. The Uma name, once carved on city gates, began vanishing overnight. Buildings once donated by the governor's family were quietly renamed. Associates disassociated. Former allies issued press statements denouncing his actions. The party suspended his membership pending investigation, but it was too late. The damage was done. His impeachment was signed unanimously. Within days, he was escorted out of Government House not by red carpet, but by security operatives. Protesters hurled sand as his convoy passed. "Go and carry your shame," someone shouted. The once proud patriarch sat in the back seat of his car, sunken-eyed and silent. He was not a man anymore, he was a warning. And still, he could not bring himself to utter Chidera's name. Not out of pride, but because he knew that name now commanded more reverence than his ever did. Amara's downfall was no less dramatic. Leaked chats, bribery proofs, and fake wire transfers tied her to multiple failed scams. Her father, Chief Maduka, denied her publicly. "She does not represent my legacy," he declared, saving his empire but abandoning his daughter. Amara vanished from social media. She was last seen leaving a boutique in Lagos, alone, with her head wrapped in a scarf. Meanwhile, the media crowned Chidera as Nigeria's phoenix, the girl who rose from ashes. Invitations for interviews, awards, and honorary degrees flooded her inbox, but she refused them all. "I don't want to be a celebrity," she told Ike. "I just want to rest beside the man who didn't trade me for the world." That man, Obinna, had other news waiting. While clearing their few belongings from a hideout in Succa, Chidera discovered an envelope tucked inside an old novel Obinna had used as a pillow. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a printed letter, now faded with time. It was a response to a proposal Obinna had submitted before leaving London, a vision for a tech education startup targeting underprivileged children in Africa. The company had finally replied, "We are impressed. We'd love to discuss partnership." The letter had arrived while they were on the run, unopened, forgotten. Chidera screamed, and Obinna rushed in thinking something was wrong. But as she handed him the letter, both of them burst into laughter and tears. It wasn't just a job. It was a sign, a fresh door not handed down by legacy, but earned through their shared pain and perseverance. The beginning of the wealth they would build together. The discovery of the letter was like unearthing a seed long buried beneath chaos. Obinna sat by the window of their modest home, reading the faded print over and over. "We are impressed with your proposal. We believe your model aligns with our goals for long-term impact across underserved communities." It wasn't just a yes. It was an invitation to a partnership with one of the most respected European education tech companies. A chance to build not on political power or a family name, but on a vision born in silence. Chidera sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder, both of them overwhelmed by the idea that something good had survived the fire. It was a divine irony. The same dream he once thought irrelevant had waited for them like a promise from the universe. And now, after everything they'd lost, it was still there, waiting. They made the call the next day, using a borrowed phone in a cafe miles from a city. The company was stunned to hear from Obinna, and even more stunned when he explained the silence. "You're not just talented," the executive said. "You're resilient. Let's begin again." Within weeks, travel documents were arranged. The company offered them a base in Ghana, neutral ground, with access to both rural and urban outreach. But Obinna insisted the headquarters must remain in Nigeria. This is where it started. This is where it heals, he said. They named the firm Rooted, a symbol of staying grounded no matter how high the branches grow. Chidera, now showing visibly in her pregnancy, became the co-founder and curriculum lead. Her experience as a teacher in the village was woven into every layer of the design. Obinna handled strategy and infrastructure. They worked late nights, sharing dreams, laughter, and the occasional tears of relief. As news of their venture spread, former staff who had suffered under the governor reached out. Matilda offered to coordinate logistics. Cunnell became their lead driver. Even Dyke, the journalist, volunteered to run communications. The press, hungry for stories of redemption, tried to recenter the narrative on Uma's downfall. But Obinna and Chidera refused interviews. Let our work speak, they said. Their first project was a school in Nsukka, the same village that once hid them, betrayed them, and healed them. It was called the Lantern House, a place where no child would be mocked for dreaming. And on its gate was a plaque that read, "Dedicated to every voice silenced by power, and every love that survived it." The sun set gently over the mango tree, where the story had once begun. There were no gold chairs, no politicians, no camera crews, just a handmade arch wrapped in cloth and flowers. Chidera stood beneath it in a simple dress, glowing with the grace of a woman who had lived through hell and come out holding heaven. Her hair was woven in soft braids. Her eyes sparkled with quiet strength. And there, waiting for her at the end of the path, was Obinna, not the governor's son, not the heir of power, but the man she loved. Dressed in white native wear, barefoot on the grass, he smiled as if every tear had been worth it. Their wedding was a gathering of hearts, not status. The old couple who had hidden them in their home were present, wiping tears as vows were exchanged. They did not promise riches or crowns. They promised to never forget, to hold hands through storms, to build, to teach, to forgive, but never to return to chains. Lady Evelyn, now free from her husband's shadow, walked Chidera down the aisle. She apologized not with words, but with actions. She had resigned her public roles and volunteered to serve in Rooted's women's literacy program. Dyke stood nearby, teary-eyed but silent, documenting not for the press, but for memory. "This is not just a wedding," he whispered to Cunnell. "It's the rebuilding of a soul." When Obinna placed the ring on Chidera's finger, he leaned close and whispered, "This ring didn't come from politics. It came from peeling yam in hiding with you." She laughed, kissed him, and the guests cheered. They danced into the night under lanterns that lit up the village, not for royalty, but for love. In the years that followed, Rooted expanded across Nigeria. Thousands of children passed through its gates. Women once cast aside became staff and mentors. Chidera's pregnancy led to the birth of a daughter they named Ndidi, after her late mother, the woman who raised her with dignity and rice from an old pot. Obinna never returned to politics. He rejected all calls to run for office. "I have nothing to govern but my home, my company, and my peace," he said. Governor Uma was eventually sentenced to years in prison. Amara disappeared from the public eye. And the name Uma, once used to open doors, was now a story told to warn children about the cost of pride. But in a quiet part of Enugu, under the mango tree, the real legacy blossomed. Not in palaces, not in posters, but in people, and in the kind of wealth that power could never buy. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.